It's always a privilege to welcome home friends, alumni for homecoming weekend. It's a delight to have you here. Look out into the congregation and see faces that are familiar from your time of study here and from other alumni weekends. These things we call alumni weekends, or if it's high school reunion gatherings, are interesting things, aren't they? This last week I read one person who attended their 40th reunion from high school who said this: I recently went to my 40th reunion. A bunch of old people showed up. They looked like the parents of the people I knew in high school. It was freaky. Got me to thinking of the story I read of 4 women in a car who were stopped by the police officer, who walked up to the car and saw that they all had hair the color of my beard. He noticed the 3 passengers were quite shaken. The driver not so much so. He said, "Do you know why I've stopped you?" "No, why is that?" "I stopped you because of the speed you were traveling. You were going 22 miles an hour. You're going to cause an accident." And she said, "Well, that's the speed limit." "No, it's not the speed." "How do you know that's the speed limit?" "That sign right there," she said, showed him a sign that said 22 on it. He said, "Man, that's the highway, not the speed limit." And he said, "Now, why are the other 3 in this car so shaken up?" She said, "They'll be fine. We just got off Route 127. And so you come back for alumni weekend, drive around Loma, walk around campus, and I've heard some of you say it already. Wow, things are different. This looks very different than it used to. It's a different world. And it is indeed a different world in many ways. Just like the neurosurgeon I read about, came back from vacation only to find his basement flooded. And when I say flooded, flooded. He immediately called the plumber, "Please come quick. It is almost to the top, flooded." The plumber drove up in a late model Mercedes. Got out, dressed to the nines. What seems to be the problem? He told him the problem. He said, "I'll take care of it." Opened his trunk, took out some it looked like scuba diving equipment. Mask, oxygen tank, underwater flashlight, put on his wetsuit, disappeared down into the basement, only to reappear maybe 3, 4, 5 minutes later. Look of triumph. It's all taken care of. What was the problem? The problem was somebody left the spigot on and they left the plug in the drain. So I pulled the plug and turned off the spigot. It'll all drain in a few hours. You'll be fine. Well, good. I'm glad. How much? $2,500. $2,500. Are you kidding me? I don't get that much for 3 or 4 appointments leading up to major brain surgery. The plumber said, "I know, I used to be a neurosurgeon." The world has changed. And then we come to alumni weekend, and they say the focus of alumni weekend, homecoming weekend, is transforming tomorrow. Transforming tomorrow. And it immediately causes me to ask the question, what might Jesus say about transforming tomorrow? I take you to a parable this morning. It was just read to us, read well by Mrs. Judy Hart and her daughter, who took us to a parable that I'm guessing they said, "Wait a second, what is this parable all about?" Luke 16. Some argue it's the strangest parable Jesus ever told. In fact, one commentary I read had a warning for preachers that said, "Be careful preaching on this because you may get fired just like the man in the parable got fired." It's just that strange. But we're going there because I want to suggest to you that it has something to say to us about how to transform tomorrow. So Luke's Gospel, chapter 16, we start with verse 1. Jesus told his disciples, "There was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, 'What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' The manager said to himself, 'What shall I do now? My master's taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. So he called in each one of his master's debtor. He asked the first, how much do you owe my master? 900 gallons of olive oil, he replied. The manager told him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 450. Then he asked the second, and how much do you owe? 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. He told him, take your bill and make it 800. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly, for the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of light. What in the world? Word like that spreads quickly. See that guy over there? He's swindling the master out of money. It doesn't take long for that news to get to the owner. Bring him in. He comes in. He says, look, I hear what you're doing, and I'm through with it. Bring in the books. I want to look at the books, review the books, and you're finished. You're done. At that moment, panic sets in. He becomes extremely focused on what to do to take care of himself. So he quickly comes up with an idea. He'll just cook the books. And so he calls in the different people. Come in. He says, I've got to talk to you. And he's thinking in his own mind, I don't want to be out there working in excavation, and I sure don't want to stand at the freeway exit with a sign that says, we'll work for food. I don't want any of that. So come in here. How much do you owe? Cut it in half. How much do you owe? Write down that you paid $200. It's all going to be good, taken care of. Now imagine you came here one Sabbath, and I happened to be telling the children's story that Sabbath. And that's the story I tell the kids. Tell the kids, yeah, this guy is acting unethically, dishonestly. He cooks the books, and that's the story that is told. So kids, go back to your seats, have a good Sabbath, hang out with your parents the rest of the day. It wouldn't take long for a phone to be ringing in Riverside at Southeastern California Conference, and the conference president to say, don't worry, we're going to have a little come to Jesus talk with Randy. And I would say to him, that's where I got it. I got it from Jesus. He's the one that told it. I was just repeating it. What in the world? Now, as if that's not enough, you notice the last verse we read, right? Verse 8. Not only does he tell the parable, but then it says the master commended the servant, commended him. What in the world, Jesus, is going on? What does this parable mean? I'd like to read you the words of one New Testament scholar, J. William Harkins, who puts it about as succinctly as anyone can. He writes, someone once said there are two kinds of parables. One is the go and do thou likewise type of parable. The second is the how much more type. This one is the latter, the how much more type. If a dishonest manager can ensure his future with shrewdness, how much more should we Christians behave shrewdly in advancing the cause of the kingdom? If in the business world, cleverness and risk-taking are recipes for success, how much more should those committed to the church be creative and willing to take risks in their participation of the kingdom of God? Careful now. He's not saying to act unethically, but what Jesus is saying, to put it very simply, is this. If a person who functions by the mores of this world, when his future is compromised, will go to every length possible to make certain that tomorrow is taken care of, how much more should the children of the kingdom be willing to go to every length to make sure that the eternal tomorrow is taken care of? If he does this for a temporal tomorrow, how much more should you be willing to do anything possible to secure your eternal tomorrow? That's what he's driving at. In fact, a couple of commentaries put it this way: learn a good lesson from a bad example. The bad example, the dishonest manager, the unethical steward. The good lesson, be willing to do whatever it takes to secure tomorrow, especially your eternal tomorrow. But it's what Jesus says after he's done with the parable that I think in particular gives us food for thought. We come here thinking about transforming tomorrow. So what exactly would that look like? I think Jesus says 4 simple things as he finishes the parable in terms of what it can mean to transform tomorrow. The first thing, if we want to transform tomorrow, we need to pay as much attention to tomorrow as we do to today. We need to pay as much attention to tomorrow as we do to today. I want to read again verse 8. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of light. He's saying the people of this world, they will do whatever is necessary to secure a temporal tomorrow. You do that about an eternal tomorrow. The reality is, especially in our younger years, is we don't tend to give all that much thought to tomorrow. We live today. After all, we have the world by the tail. All of life is ahead of us. But somehow we seem to move through time in a vehicle called now, and that now never stops moving forward. I was just saying to someone this morning after first service, when I came to work here at Loma Linda, first in the chaplain's office, then at the School of Religion, and then the privilege of joining this pastoral team at the church, in every one of those settings, I was almost, if not the youngest person in the room, in every one. And then I turned around twice, and now I'm the oldest person in the room. And it's what happened? Where did it go? Because back then I wasn't giving much thought at all to tomorrow. But this dishonest manager says there comes a moment in time when we become single-eyed, crystal clear, eagle-eyed on what tomorrow will bring. We become focused on it because we realize our time is limited. Talking about being single-minded. I read from Betty Bishop, a woman out of Florida, told about a little boy, a friend of their family. Family doesn't have much by ways of this world's money. Not much means. But the little boy was always late to school, late to practice, late to band, late to everything. His father had it. And he finally said, okay, I'm going to try something positive. I tried all the negative. I'm going to try something positive. So he said to him, if you can be on time all week long to everything, I'll buy you a brand new watch. He thought he'll never make it. End of the week, he'd been on time every single time. He said, Dad, I want that watch. Now Dad was in a panic because he didn't have the money for it. He said, okay, I'll get it to you, but it's just gonna take me a little bit. Next day, Dad, the watch. It'll take me a little. Next day, Dad, the watch. Finally, the dad got so fed up, he said, listen, if you mention that watch one more time, I'm not going to get it to you at all. They sat down that evening for dinner. They had a custom. Each one would say a Bible verse at dinner that night. And so the young man, little boy, who had paid attention, quoted him Mark 13:37, Jesus talking to the disciples about readiness for his coming. Came his turn, he looked up and he said, Jesus said, and what I say to you, I say to all, watch. You got to admire that kind of single-eyed focus. It's what the dishonest manager has, and it's what Jesus is encouraging us to have. To remember, even in our younger years, that it's a whole lot easier to live it up than it is to live it down. It's a whole lot easier to live as though there is no tomorrow than to realize all the choices I make along the way will have consequences at some point in the journey of life. So invest in things that count and that matter, and do so with a crystal clear focus. The way to transform tomorrow is to pay as much attention to tomorrow as we normally do to today. But he tells us a second thing. Not only pay as much attention to tomorrow as you do to today, but secondly, pay as much attention to your neighbor as you do to yourself. Pay as much attention to your neighbor as you do to yourself. Actually, I want to read this one, verse 9, out of the New Century Version. I thought it rendered it particularly well. Verse 9, I tell you, make friends for yourselves using worldly riches so that when those riches are gone, you will be welcome in those homes that continue forever. Seems odd, doesn't it? Jesus, it almost sounds like it's saying, use your money to make friends because it will have eternal payoff. But if you read Jesus within his context, he is saying that, but in a different way than we tend to say it. He is saying, use your means, whatever blessings God has poured into your life, use those in a way that will make a difference in other people's lives. And when you make a difference in their lives, that will have eternal consequences. You want to pay attention to tomorrow and transform tomorrow? Then pay as much attention to your neighbor as you do to yourself. Years ago, probably 12, 15 years ago, I read a story, shared a story actually at the time, that had quite an impact on me. It created a dream in me. I thought, what if we did something like this unawares here to 2 or 3 kids in Loma Linda? The story was written by John Ortberg, at that time pastor, now no longer pastoring, well-known writer. He writes this in May 2009. My family was in Azusa, California, because one of our kids was graduating from Azusa Pacific University. My wife, Nancy, was going to speak at the commencement ceremony, so she and I were invited to a special gathering of about 50 people. People from the graduating class of 50 years ago and a few faculty members. During the gathering, John Wallace, the president of APU, brought out 3 students who were graduating that year and told us that for the next 2 years, they were going to serve the poorest of the poor in India. These 3 students thought that they were just there to be commissioned and sent out with a blessing, which they were. But then something happened that they did not know was coming. John, the president, turned to them and said, I have a piece of news for you. There's somebody you do not know, an anonymous donor, who is so moved by what you're doing that he has given a gift to this university in your name and on your behalf. John turned to the first student and said, you are forgiven your student debt of $105,000 because of that gift. The kid immediately starts to cry. John turns to the next student. You're forgiven your debt of $70,000. Then he turns to the third student. You're forgiven your debt of $130,000. All 3 students had no idea this was coming. They were just ambushed by grace, blown away that someone they don't even know would pay their debt. The whole room was in tears. Now just think about that. What that did to transform their tomorrows. And then think about what they did in another part of the world and what that would do to transform the tomorrows of others. And think of that in the context of knowing that in this community called Loma Linda University Health and Church, in this community, this kind of story has been repeated time and again by pouring into the lives of other people, because people are paying as much attention to their neighbors as they are to themselves. That's a way to transform tomorrow. I don't know what that will mean for you. It might mean finding a family in your neighborhood who needs their tomorrow transformed. It might mean finding a student for whom that is the case. It might mean a special project. It might mean that you don't have means to give and you show up with your time, with your talent, with your willingness. But what it has in common, no matter where it happens, is I'm paying as much attention to my neighbor, at least, as I am to myself. And Jesus suggests that will transform tomorrow. Not only theirs, but even yours. You want to transform tomorrow? then listen to what Jesus says about a dishonest manager, and pay as much attention to tomorrow as you do to today, to your neighbor as you do to yourself. And then thirdly, pay as much attention to the little as you do to the large. Pay as much attention to the little as you do to the large. Notice in the next verses we read, Jesus is driving toward the little, because when we think of the kinds of ways that we will transform tomorrow, we understandably turn our mind toward big projects, big things. But notice what Jesus says. Luke 16, once again, this time we go to verse 10. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? He's talking about the small things, the things that most other people would never notice, the realities to which they would never give heed. And he's saying, if you're doing it in those contexts, those situations, then the bigger ones will take care of themselves whenever they come. So if you want to transform tomorrow, pay as much attention to the little as you do to the large. It's not to demean the large. It's only to say that for most of us, the little is the currency in which we operate. We can be faithful there. So it's an alumni weekend. So a story from a reunion, although this one, a high school reunion, seems in order. A woman named Julie Morrison wrote the story on Huffington Post. Morrison said that when she was in high school, it was good. She had a good high school experience overall, but there was an experience that was particularly painful for her. So when her 20th anniversary came around, she was eager to go back to see if she might encounter the person involved in that incident. She said, I went back with a lot of mixed feelings. It all had to do with a Sadie Hawkins event. That was the event where the high school girls would ask a high school boy to go with them, and they reversed the roles that were so common at the time, and in some cases still are. She said, I knew who I wanted to ask. He was the student body president. She said, I made it very creative. I got some construction paper. I took time to write a cheesy poem. I made sure it was decorated nicely. I made sure it was very well done. And then I went over to his house. My mother came with me, and we ran into his brother there. He wasn't home. And so I said, would you please make sure that he gets this? So he got it. A couple of days of silence, no response. But finally his response came. He said yes. And she said, great. Now at that point, I want to read it to you in her words. She says, I saved my weekend nanny money, babysitting money, and bought these crimson and gray sweaters. They were my school's colors, and I thought they were perfect. I made plans for my hair appointment, and I made plans for the dinner. I bought the tickets and had money set aside for the pictures. It was going to be amazing. I was almost giddy. The Wednesday before the event, Mr. Prez said he would rather go with this other girl who had recently asked him and asked me, would that be okay? I was polite and concerned about other people's feelings, so I smiled and said, sure, that would be great. I hope you have a good time. I suppose I sincerely meant it. I mean, why would you want to go with someone who didn't want to be there with you? He gave me back the sweater. I canceled my dinner plans and hair appointment. He went to the dance. I stayed home. Life went on. Fast forward. 20 years later, I'm going to the reunion. There's no other reason aside from the fact that I've decided to go to tell Mr. Prez just what a dope he was. His rejection haunted me. I had drilled into my own boy's head that if they say yes to a girl for a date, they go. There's no discussion, no second thought. They grew up hearing me tell this story. At the reunion, I sit through the uneventful night looking for him, but I can't seem to identify him. I finally say to my husband, "You think he didn't come?" There's a drawing for prizes, and they call his name. Wait, there he is. I excuse myself and go up to the front of the reunion and wait as someone else has acquired his attention. I wait, and finally, I decide I look perhaps desperate standing there alone, and so I go and sit back down. A little while later, I see he's returned to his table, so I excuse myself again. I rehearse what I'm going to say as I walk to his table. With a big grin, I say, "Mr. President." She writes, I didn't really say that. I used his real name, but you get the picture. "How in the world are you?" He turned, saw me, and said, "Hello, Julie. I'm surprised you remember my name." There was no doubt a tad hint of bitterness in my voice. "I remember you. I've thought about you through the years and what I did to you. It's the one regret I have. It's not that I thought about it all the time, but I thought about it. I'm very sorry for what I did." Tears start to well up, and I choke up. He continued, "I told my family, my children, I'm sorry." I replied, "I told my children too. They even know that if an unappealing girl asks them first and they say yes, they are taking her." He then turned and introduced me to his wife, and she said, "Oh, memories, good or bad?" And he said, "This is Julie." Oh, she winced. Bad memories. He told me the story, she said to me, and he is so sorry. Tell her you're sorry. He said, "I did. I already told her. I'm sorry. I'm very sorry." I asked his wife, "Would you mind taking that Sadie Hawkins picture for me now?" She smiled and stepped closer. He put his arm around me, and we took our picture. Upon leaving, I said, "Mr. President, I knew you as a boy. I will remember you as a man." Just one simple thing. I am sorry. So small. And yet it transformed tomorrows. We often think, if I want to transform tomorrow, I have to be involved in something big, the latest thing, the most expensive, the biggest thing. I am thankful for those who are able to do that, absolutely. But for the vast majority of us, it will be like Jesus suggests. If you're faithful in those little things, God will use that for bigger and bigger things. So who knows? It might be at this alumni weekend that you need to talk to somebody. You need to say, "I'm sorry. I remember, and I was wrong. Will you forgive me?" Because if you want to transform tomorrows, you have to pay as much attention to the little as you do to the large. So we go back one last time, Luke 16. Jesus is talking about transforming tomorrows. Pay as much attention to tomorrow as you do to today, to your neighbor as you do to yourself, to the little as you do to the large. And then finally, he says, pay as much attention to giving as you do to getting. The last verse of his commentary, verse 13, "No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." It's a very familiar text to us. We know that it puts in juxtaposition God and money, and that you cannot serve them both. You can serve God and use money well. Maybe God will give you a lot of money to decide exactly how you manage that, but you can't serve them both. I want to suggest to you that there may be no better way to keep that in balance than to keep giving, to focus on giving, to find creative ways to give. And it may not always be money, though sometimes it is. But find creative ways to think about pouring into other people's lives, sharing with other people, bringing joy to other people. Because when your focus is on giving, not just on getting, you will not only transform the lives of others, you will transform your own life. Because the truth is, for those whose focus is getting and getting and getting, the news isn't all that great. I want to read to you 5 just 1 or 2 sentence statements from 5 of maybe the best known wealthy people in recent memory. Now, in these people's lifetimes, they were multi-millionaires. But I checked, and in each case today, they would have been multi-billionaires. So 5 people. They had focused on getting, and they had gotten. What did they have to say about it? Andrew Carnegie, millionaires seldom smile. John D. Rockefeller, I've made many millions, but they have brought me no happiness. W.H. Vanderbilt, the care of 200 million is enough to kill anyone. There is no pleasure in it. John Jacob Astor, I am the most miserable man on earth. And finally, Henry Ford, I was happier doing a mechanic's job. People who had it all and who said, if you're looking for happiness, it doesn't come driving down this street. But the truth is, even after I read that, I want to say, but God, just give me a chance, just a little chance. There might be a possible way through that, and I'd be happy to try it. It's kind of woven into all of us, isn't it? And yet Jesus says you can't serve both. You need the money, and you definitely need God. So how do you keep them in balance? What if one of the best ways to keep them in balance is to say, I will focus on giving of all kinds, but including my money. I will keep an open heart, an open hand, not a closed fist and a hard heart. I will give, I will pour into people of true need, if for nothing else, so that God can keep my heart soft. And in doing that, you will not only transform their tomorrows, you will transform your tomorrow. So we come. Homecoming. Alumni celebration. See friends and family walk the familiar sidewalks and sit in the familiar halls and classes and think about transforming tomorrow. You know, I think Jesus, were he to speak to us, might tell us this story, this bizarre, strange story that essentially says, do everything at your disposal, everything you need to secure an eternal and a healthy tomorrow. And we might respond by saying, how do we do that? Maybe he would say, pay as much attention to tomorrow as you do to today. Pay as much attention to your neighbor as you do to yourself. Pay as much attention to the little as you do to the large. Pay as much attention to giving as you do to getting. And one day at a time, one person at a time, one heart at a time, we transform tomorrow. Because after all, Abraham Lincoln probably said it best when he said, the best thing about tomorrow is that it arrives just one day at a time.